Yes, I'm here. Can you see me?
Loud and clear.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. And I welcome all of you all over the globe. As everyone has said, this is virtual. We are all in different locations, but that's one good thing about technology. Can bring everybody together. Today's topic has been well put before us. The topic is very timely to all of us who are in the oil and gas industry, given the situation that has bedeviled everybody. There's no doubt if there's anything we can do to bring down the cost, certainly welcome, so that at least we're more profitable. So the title for today's presentation is very apt, Country Finding and Development Costs by Revealing Hidden Insights from Seismic and Subsurface Data Analysis to Drive Exploration and Development Decisions. Quite often than not,
whether that will work.
We don't do too much justice to Seismic. And we're also very fortunate that the speaker today cannot be anyone else. Laura Weston has a BSc honor in physics and astrology, and also has a PhD in geophysics. So, and a little bit about her biography. She has over 30 years career as a geophysicist. Laura has been in the oil and gas industry from many perspectives. She's been a part of the evolution of exploration objectives and analysis techniques, both as a scientist and as an entrepreneur. As you can see, she founded and owned her own company. So not so many people can do that. Kudos to her. Laura's career began with Shell in Canada, in Calgary, doing seismic processing and interpretation in the Central Plain area of Alberta. Looking for adventures and travel, she took a position with Lasmo PLC in London to work on various European and North American and Middle Eastern exploration projects. So upon her return to Canada, Laura consulted with Next in Canada, ISM, before founding her own seismic quantitative interpretation, that's the QI consulting company, in 2007. The company called Oil Sands Imaging was later rebranded as Sound IQ and sold to Canadian Discovery in 2012. I'm sure she made some money from that. And then in early 2007, Laura went back and reacquired back the IQ business. What an interesting journey from Canadian Discovery, and restarted this Sound IQ again. So while she always maintains a respect and a healthy skepticism of data and data analysis, Laura, as you can see from her education, fully understands that being a successful member of an exploration or development team takes a combination of hard data, imaging, creativity, and collaboration. And so that is what she's going to be taking us through today. She had the background education, the experience, both in major oil company, independent investor, and also venture into some other things. So ladies and gentlemen, I bring before you Laura Weston.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Andrew, for that introduction. I'm very pleased to be here and speaking for NAPE on behalf of Sound QI and Mega Yield. I'd like to share my screen and get started with the presentation. So as Dr. Andrew mentioned, today we're going to talk about cutting, finding, and development costs. And this is mainly going to be accomplished from our perspective by integrating and incorporating seismic and subsurface data analysis to really drive exploration and development decisions efficiently. Now, you're probably all familiar with this particular workflow: acquisition of seismic data, processing of seismic data, quantitative attributes. So this involves AVO, inversion, advanced analysis, and finally interpretation. And if the size of the screen is your timeline, we usually find a way to fill it. In fact, we often don't have enough time. And so if we talk about timing, the acquisition might take a month, the processing might take 4 months, the quantitative attribute analysis and generation might take another 4 months. And then we start interpretation. So how long does interpretation take? Well, it can take 6 months, it can take 10 months, who knows? It's usually a bit of an unknown because we always want to investigate more and more and more. And we can actually squeeze our decision-making right to the very end of that process. And often we don't have a lot of time for making effective decisions then. So what I'm proposing is that we branch off of that side of this particular timeline, and we start interpretation earlier in the process, and we shorten that interpretation. And that gives us time for actual decision scenarios, not just making quick decisions, but looking at all the possibilities and options. What about if we could branch off that timeline earlier and still have shorter interpretation time? Then we would have even longer for our decision scenarios and even economic analysis. And in fact, we could even go further back. And then not only do we have time for decision scenarios and economics, but we actually start drilling our wells sooner. And so by shortening time to insights, we have a faster path to the revenue that we're all here for. So in this presentation, I'm going to, first of all, introduce the workflow objectives. Then I'm going to share with you 2 QI case studies, and QI stands for quantitative interpretation, if I haven't already mentioned that. 2 QI case studies, one in Chad and one in the North Sea. The next thing I want to talk about is incorporating all attributes to reveal insights, uncertainty and sensitivity, future developments, and finally, recap and summary. So looking at that workflow in a little more detail, here's what I call the typical oil and gas company workflow. We start with data collection, which is partly acquisition, but by the time we start what we want to do with the analysis and interpretation of data, we're mainly collecting it from people's workstations, from guest tours, from various other places that we might find it, from the lab, etc. And so we have various different data types: production data, well logs, core data, lab tests, seismic data, and models. Conceptual geological models are very important in this process. Then we go through a layer of data integrity, data analysis, which is the QI part, interpretation, and finally decisions. Now, this is what I call ideal. It is ideal. Here's what actually happens in reality. In reality, we start our data collection. We don't have everything. We have maybe well logs, core data, and some models in mind. We go through a skinny data integrity section because we're anxious to get to looking at the results of the data. We start some analysis, and then we get our seismic data. So and maybe some lab tests from the core. And then we have to go back and do a little bit more data integrity because we've realized there's probably some issues with the data after this part of the analysis. We've realized there's some issues. We've also acquired more data, so we spend some more time on that. In the meantime, we're anxious to get to the answer, so we start interpreting. We start doing interpretation early in the process. Then we get into our QI. We finish the data integrity. We start doing the quantitative interpretation. In the meantime, we're still, our team is anxious for answers. Our managers are anxious for answers. So we're doing more interpretation. And then a little bit more partway through the analysis process. And finally, decisions. Well, in actual fact, the decisions may have already been made earlier, even earlier. And maybe they were made entirely outside of this process because this process has been taking too long. And I can't even wait for this arrow to finish because it can take a year or more to go through this. This is the reality though. This is our real workflow. And then when we've done it all, then we get some production data. Maybe some wells have been drilled in the meantime. We get some more well logs and we've completely changed our models. So we have to re-inform our concepts. And then we start the whole process over again. So this is the reality. How do we work within this reality, make it more efficient so that the decision makers can wait for us to finish and actually have well-informed decisions. Our objective with seismic data is, of course, to get to the rocks, and ideally to get even further than that, to get to fluids and predict production, predict the best production. There are many ways of doing this, of predicting rocks at least. Seismic attributes, inversion, geostats, and machine learning. And all of these have their various assumptions, their various uncertainties, different parameters we have to choose, different expertise. There's different experts that know how to do all of these things. And in fact, people tend to choose their favorites. If you're a seismic attribute person, you don't want anybody to talk to you about inversion or geostats. You think attributes are going to solve all your problems. Well, we at SoundQI, we don't think that you should choose one and stick to it. These approaches all have their merits. They all have different capabilities and information they can bring to the table. And we need all of that. So they don't have to be mutually exclusive. Why not use them all? So we incorporate all of these things. Well, we don't do geostats ourselves, but certainly the outputs that we create in the workflow I'm going to show you are already conditioned for a geostats model. So in terms of seismic integration, a lot of times I've seen that teams are kind of skeptical about some of the things we can get from seismic data. So what have we got when we talk about seismic data? Well, often we have ambiguous results. We're not sure of the uncertainty. We're not sure of the confidence we can have in the results we're delivering to the team. We have too many sources of information to integrate successfully. That can be difficult to validate. We don't know what's correct, what's not correct. It often takes too long to get to an answer. So that leaves us no time to investigate multiple realizations or scenarios, no time to investigate alternate solutions, alternate geological models. And that can lead to frustration. Not only frustration from the side of the interpreter, because they either don't have the tools, they aren't getting the data as fast, or the processing as fast as they would like to, but there's also pressure on them from the team and the organization to deliver. So we don't like frustration. What do we want? Well, in a seismic integration process, we want it to be easy. I'm talking relatively easy because, of course, we're all highly educated. We can understand some fairly complex workflows, but we want it to be not onerous to use. We want it to be complete. We don't want to miss anything that could contain valuable information to help increase the accuracy of our predictions. We want it to be flexible so that we can work with the data that we have on hand and add as more data becomes available, accommodate different data types and scales of data, things like multi-component data or 4D or microseismic or anything that may help us understand our reservoirs. We want it to be adaptable. So we want to be able to use this workflow without changing it too much, use it for QC of data products. We want to use it for potentially initial reconnaissance of an area with 2D data, perhaps. We want to then be able to do detailed analysis. We want to apply this to different basins or play types, and we want to be able to incorporate new data easily. Above all, we want it to be fast. We want it to be interactive, responsive. We want to be able to do workflows, processes, and computations on the fly. So all of this is ideal. And what we really want to do is build that so that we can eventually, ideally, go from something like this to something like this. So this is our conventional seismic data. What we want to see is a geological cross-section made from that conventional seismic data and all the other available inputs that are going to give us the details that we're looking for and the accuracy we really want. So this is a picture of a project. I'm going to go through this as a case study pretty soon, but you can see that what we've got here are actual geological properties. We've got shale, we've got low net to gross, and within the high net to gross, we've got low, medium, and high porosity. So that's what this is signifying. You can see how it's tying the well. And this is what we really want to get to. We want to get to something that the whole team can then inspect, analyze, and understand the reservoir and get to decisions that everybody has confidence in. So I'm going to show you two workflows, or two case studies, sorry, that show how we have actually managed to we've managed to branch off from this timeline, from this workflow, and shorten our interpretation time so that we have more time for decision scenarios, or our clients do. So the first workflow case study is in the Jojoba Basin in Chad, not far from Nigeria. You're all aware of where your neighbors are, and the volve field in central North Sea. So both of these are highly structured. I've got a sample seismic line here showing the structure and the extent of the reservoir zones, multiple reservoir zones. Then there's the schematic cross section here of the central graben in the North Sea, and the volve field sits on this faulted block up here. Both of these are published case studies. The first one, the rock physics-based classification of the Jojoba Basin of Chad, that's published as an extended abstract for the Geoconvention in 2016 by Carl Riney, who is SoundQI's chief geophysicist. And the second one, obtaining fault-controlled pore pressure and model of lithology distribution in the central North Sea. That's actually an accepted extended abstract for the EAGE in Amsterdam coming up in December in 2020. And this is by our senior geophysicist, Draga Talinga, and our chief geophysicist, Carl Riney. So in the Jojoba Basin, here's an example set of well logs. And on the left, you see we've got the V shale log, the gamma ray log, with the sands highlighted in yellow. And here's the sonic log, the shear sonic log, sorry, the P-wave sonic log, the shear sonic log, and the density log. And you can see that our sand layers are very interbedded. The maximum thickness is around 30 meters, but most of them are 1 to 5 meters in thickness. And they've actually got very similar properties. So if we look at a constant line on all of these logs, you see that the sands all touch on that line. So they're all very similar properties. And you can see from these histograms of data distribution that if we looked at the P impedance of, the P impedance and the VPVS ratio properties of the rocks here, and we color these by V shale color bar. So the red is the shale and the blue is the sand. We can see that in P impedance and in VPVS space, the shales and the sands are quite separate. So from a rock physics point of view, we're going to be able to easily distinguish sands and shales. However, because of the interbedded nature of these stacked reservoirs, and all of these can be prospective reservoirs, the interbedded nature means that we're going to have a difficult time imaging these in the seismic data and getting the resolution required to identify the individual sand layers. So what we did in this project was, instead of trying to identify the individual sand layers, which mostly are below seismic resolution, so if you calculate seismic resolution lambda this way, you end up with 30 meters. So a 30-meter resolution limit in the seismic data, we're not going to be able to resolve the individual layers. So instead of resolving individual beds, we targeted a net to gross in the upscaled layers. So by blocking these logs, now we can identify a particular net to gross value in each of the 30-meter intervals. When we put those on cross plots, and this is what we're looking for templates, we're looking for a rock physics basis for determining rock properties from seismic attributes. So when we look at VPVS ratio versus P impedance, and these are calculated from the log data, the original log data. This is the original samples. And we've got a rock physics template here that shows us variations in porosity and V shale. And we can see that we have our high shale samples are in red, our low shale samples are in blue, and this is our average samples. Our average samples, of course, we've gotten much fewer samples because we have averaged over 30 meters. So what we can see here, though, is we have our V shale increasing in this direction. And now that we're looking at net to gross, we can see that we have the same trend, only now its net to gross is decreasing in that direction. So that's still helpful for our geological predictions that we can get from seismic data. And also, if we're looking at porosity, this is the same rock physics template that shows us increasing porosity in this direction. And this is the original well data confirming that. So then once we understand the rock physics behavior of our rocks and we understand what our target is going to be. So our target, of course, is the net to gross, as I mentioned. And within the high net to gross, we would like to subclassify that by porosity. But in order to get these attributes that are on our X and Y axis, VPVS ratio and P impedance, we need to do a Prestack seismic inversion. Now, Prestack seismic inversion, I'm not going to go into the details for that here today, but you're probably all familiar with this and to some degree. But Prestack seismic inversion is a process where we are modeling the elastic properties from the Prestack seismic data. So we're trying to predict P impedance, S impedance, and density by modeling the Prestack gathers and determining P impedance, S impedance, and density that will create those Prestack gathers synthetically. So the outputs are what I'm showing you here. And here's, again, our gamma ray log. Here's our P wave sonic and S wave sonic. And here's the P impedance curve. And you can see that our predicted P impedance from the Prestack inversion, when overlaying on the log data, is pretty much the resolution that we expected when we blocked our logs to create that rock physics model. So the P impedance curve that you see here in red is the kind of resolution that we were expecting. Oops. And we're now looking at this in terms of the S impedance and the density as well, with the same resolution. And the log that is put inside these volumes is the original log. It has not been upscaled. So when we look at the rock physics template, and we know that we have our net to gross increasing in that direction, we can then overlay our equivalent seismic attributes on the same template. So where we used log data to calculate the VPVS and the P impedance, now we are looking at our seismically derived P impedance cross-plotted against our seismically derived VPVS. And when we overlay that template that shows us the various quantitative values of V shale and porosity, we can then identify the high net to gross, which are down at the bottom, the medium net to gross in the light green and the brown, and the low net to gross, or the high V shale in the green. So by identifying those regions, guided by the rock physics template and the log data calibration, we are able to classify both the net to gross and the porosity. So our high net to gross is down here, and we've now taken this porosity trend and subdivided the seismic data according to that trend. So this gives us these properties that we're looking for in our seismic data and assigns them in the cross-plot domain. This really allows us to shorten our interpretation time by doing our interpretation in the cross-plot domain, not the spatial domain. So a lot of times what people will get delivered are these elastic property volumes, and they'll put it into their three-dimensional seismic interpretation system, and they'll be interpreting boundaries, they'll be interpreting truncations, they'll be interpreting faults, and really it's much faster if we can do that interpretation interactively in the cross-plot domain. And by doing that, we can transform our conventional seismic data. Here in this cross-plot classification, we've identified the low net to gross, the medium low net to gross, the medium high net to gross, and that is classified portions of our seismic cube based on those attributes. Now, these are all interactive boundaries. In the software, we can adjust these, and you can see instantly what the effect is on your prediction of the geology, and you can interactively tie these with your well logs. So I've left the high net to gross zones unclassified, and that's because we are going to classify them in a separate direction. We're going to put in different divisions that show us how we can classify those high net to gross regions or subclassify them into a low, medium, and high porosity. So we have our final classification done very quickly. And the whole team can understand how these classifications are assigned and validated. So what I call this the QI transformation, seismic data to a geological cross-section. And this gives us an output that allows us to make decisions quickly. Imagine having a geological map like this instead of your perhaps seismic amplitude map. This now you can very quickly and easily see the extent of your high porosity. The wells in this field were all drilled right around here, but we can see there's more prospectivity. And if this is overlain by a structural contour map, then we've got a very good starting point for determining our exploration or completion objectives. The second case study I want to show you is the volve field in the central North Sea. And this one again is a highly structured play. This is on a series of fault blocks. The field itself is compartmentalized by many faults, and you can see that all of these wells have been drilled from the central platform in the North Sea. So there's a lot of deviations, a lot of deviated wells targeting those different fault blocks. One of the objectives in this field is to determine not only the lithology and the porosity, but also understand the pressure regime. So because the reservoir is compartmentalized, the different fault blocks may be isolated and the fluid pressures are independent in these different fault blocks. So understanding this pressure variation gives us information about the reservoir connectivity, potential for fault reactivation, and also how to complete the wells and develop the field in each compartment. So one of the first things we are doing, because we need to rely on the log data quite a lot for quantitative interpretation and for modeling of pore pressures, we need to condition some of these logs. So the original logs had gaps in them, and we started out by doing predictions of the log data for each geological zone. So for the tertiary section, this was the VP to VS relationship, and for the Cretaceous section, quite a different VP-VS relationship. And by creating those relationships, we were able to fill in the missing data, predict the missing data, and make those logs useful. Sorry, I don't know how to get rid of that line. Okay. So first of all, what we do is we want to identify in the cross-plot space appropriate attributes that are going to allow us to identify first the regional components. So just the formations is what we're looking for using elastic properties and log data. So we have our stratigraphic section here. This is in the late Jurassic. There's an unconformity at the base of the Cretaceous. And we have our three formations that are shown on these cross plots. The Heather Formation, the sand zones within the Heather Formation, which are reservoir, and the Huggen Formation, which is the main reservoir. So what we want to do is determine cross-plot spaces where we can isolate and separate these formations, because when we can do that, we can deal with properties in each formation individually. So looking at multiple cross-plots, I've got VPVS versus density, lambda over mu versus density, lambda times lambda rho over density, mu rho versus density. And we inspect these, we look at all possible elastic properties, we look at different wells individually and in aggregate, and we want to find elastic properties that are going to separate our formations for us the best. Kind of looks like the density mu rho one is the one that is giving us the most distinction between the three formations. And the sand in the Heather Formation versus the shale is also relatively distinct versus these other cross plots. So once we look at formations, then we start to look at formation properties. And so we focus in on the zones we're really interested in, and we look at how those properties behave in elastic property space. So we're looking for again, cross plots that are going to be able to distinguish variations in these properties. So on the left, we have P impedance VPVS cross plot, and we've got a rock physics template that shows us V shale variations. So that's the red lines, constant shale or constant V shale or constant clay and values. So this goes from low V shale at the bottom to high V shale at the top. And you can see it's calibrated against the log data, which is colored by gamma ray. This is these points are now colored by porosity. And the porosity lines of constant porosity are the blue lines. And these go from low porosity to high porosity in this direction, almost orthogonal to the shale content. And that's on the same cross plot, the VPVS versus P impedance. We also want to look at other properties of interest, including fluid properties. And so this is just part of our investigation where we're looking at trying to calibrate mu rho versus lambda rho and mu rho versus lambda over mu. We're trying to calculate or calibrate those two rock physics models. And there's always multiple models that can be chosen. Here we show two. One is the contact cement model. This is the black curves. And the other one is the Wernicke-Kachanov model in purple. So these are both models that are relevant to the particular geology in this area, the rock properties. But you can see they show us quite different trends. And this is always part of the investigation, or should be part of the investigation, where you look at not only variations in reservoir properties and variations in rock types, the kinds of things that go into creating a rock physics model, but the model itself, because there's various assumptions and parameters that can give you quite a different answer. And importantly, we always want to calibrate it to the data itself. So this shows us variations in water saturation. We've got low water saturation, or gas and oil saturated rocks in the blue, and we've got water saturation in the red. So we go ahead to the Prestack inversion. Now, once we've done our analysis and our investigation in the rock physics domain and in the well log domain, looking at the various cross plots that might be useful to separate and identify the geological properties we're interested in. Then we went to the Prestack inversion. And once again, this is a Prestack model-based inversion that produces a density, a P impedance, and an S impedance. And so you can see these products for the volve data set here with the original appropriate logs in. So the density log here, the P impedance log, and the S impedance log where it exists. Now, one of the things that, that we do fairly frequently, and this is something that a lot of companies are starting to get more and more interested in, is some sort of AI. And we use that for predicting target properties. So this is a multilinear regression. And this is a way of focusing in on a particular zone, because it needs to be zone specific. It's something that that has to be trained on a particular very limited zone. And so that we make our zone quite specific here to what we're interested in. And then we can refine and optimize the details for the particular target log we're looking for. In this case, it's density. So you can see our Prestack inversion for density has identified the main trends and features, but we're able to refine that, get a lot more accuracy and detail by focusing that and putting it through this multilinear regression process. We can also do the same thing for other target logs, such as the gamma ray and the deep resistivity. So we can create volumes from our seismic data using this multilinear regression, and in fact, even neural networks for creating these log properties that we're finding useful and interesting in the field. So this one's the gamma ray and the resistivity. And this, of course, is our main target zone here, where we're seeing the variations in resistivity. And this is our main target zone here, where you see the low gamma ray. Getting into the geomechanics now, I talked about how the pressure variations in these different fault blocks were very important for not only understanding connectivity, but also informing the drilling department about what zones might be overpressured or underpressured. So here's the velocity curve for this well, and this is compared against the normal compaction trends. So this is the normal compaction trend for the Cretaceous, for Jurassic carbonates, and for Jurassic clastics. And we can see that in the Cretaceous, which is everything above this part, or this break in the curve right here, you can see that everything is pretty much on this normal compaction curve except this zone here, which is considerably underpressured. And for the Jurassic carbonates, we find that a lot of them are overpressured. So below the curve here would be the overpressure, because that's where the velocity is too low for the normal compaction. And here in the clastics, it looks like we may have some overpressured, some normally pressured, and maybe a little bit of underpressure. So this is how we determine which part of the curve or which zone is likely to be problematic. So the next thing we want to do is try to predict our actual pore pressure, because that gives us a way of extrapolating that prediction throughout the 3D seismic data. So the blue curve here is our hydrostatic pressure. The pink curve, or the pink bar, is, let's get a curve, I suppose, is the measured pressure in the zone of interest. And this is our sonic log. And what we want to do is we want to be able to predict a pore pressure curve from the sonic log, matching the measured pressure where we have it. So and this is all going to be, if you want to look at this further, it's in the abstract. It's very detailed, extended abstract that Draga has published. And also it will be presented at the EAGE, as I mentioned, in December. But the various models were tested, and this is the resulting pore pressure curve that was predicted from incorporating multiple models in the different zones in order to get accurate pore pressure predictions on the log curve. Now, once we've done the log curve, then we have a formula for extrapolating that and applying it to the elastic properties and predicting pore pressure in the seismic data. So now we've got this, this volume that shows us how the pressure varies. And we've only got a few validation points in wells, but of course we've matched those to make sure that we are calibrating this model correctly. So here's our geological property prediction. Out of this seismic cube now, not only do we have our typical elastic properties like P impedance, S impedance, VPVS ratio, lambda rho, mu rho, we have also got what I call like the next level of properties. So the first ones are the fundamental properties, and these are taking the analysis to the next level to get gamma ray, resistivity, density, and pore pressure. And all of these are going to be valuable for our characterization of this reservoir. Now, how do we do that? So this is where things could take a lot of time. This is that interpretation part of the workflow that could take months to refine and optimize all of the different volumes and predict a geological cube. We can do this by doing it in the crossplot domain. We can do this very quickly. So we start with our mu rho density volume, because that's where volumes and crossplot, because that's where we found we were able to identify different regions and also the porosity and shale content. So I'm looking at the same crossplot with two different views. This view shows the seismic data clusters, and this view shows the classes that we've assigned to those clusters. So you can see that there's two distinct clusters here in the seismic data. And even aside from the rock physics template, if we just identify those two clusters, we will identify zones in the seismic volume that have common properties. And then after those zones are identified, then we start applying the rock physics template classification to the seismic data. First of all, increasing the shale or decreasing the shale, and then assigning different porosity values to the sand zones. Once we've determined the sand shale layers and the porosity within the sand layers, then we can go to our most prospective regions, which are the high porosity sands, and we can look at assigning pressures within those. Again, this is two views of the data clustered in this lambda P and sigma V space, and these are pressure indicators. And we are cutting off, we're finding a sweet spot within the lambda P zone that is the hydrostatic region. Anything on this side is overpressured, and anything on this side is underpressured. So by assigning those classes to those zones, we create a volume. Now this volume is just showing the first step, which is the lithology and the porosity. So our zone of interest here shows us the low, medium, and high porosity sands. These are layers, for example, the cap rock layer, and this is another sand zone here. When we do the second step, which is to assign the different pressure regions, we can see that we have subclassified those high porosity sand zones into pressure regions. And so you see both of the sand zones have now been classified by overpressure in red, hydrostatic pressure in blue, and underpressure in purple. So now we have a very clear geological cross-section of what to expect. And as all of these cutoffs and classifications in these cross plots are interactive, we're able to adjust and see the consequences and the sensitivity of our adjustments in our final cross-section. Okay, those are two case studies that showed us a very physics-based approach. And that physics-based approach is how we determine the templates that are going to describe the relationship between elastic properties, and elastic properties are really easily identified with geological properties by those templates. So what happens if you have a bunch of other attributes that you can't possibly make a template from? For example, some of the ones I've listed here. So I don't know of anybody who's been able to make a template between apparent polarity and trace envelope. We don't know what these things mean geologically. Some people say they do, but they may be correct in a small part of a 3D survey, in a particular play, in a particular basin. We don't know how to relate these directly to geology. But how do we incorporate them? Obviously, they vary because of variations in geology. We just don't know what they're responding to. And in fact, seismic attributes can represent anything that can be obtained from seismic data. So anything you can make from a seismic cube is considered an attribute. So they may be instantaneous attributes, wavelet attributes, physical attributes such as our elastic properties, geometrical attributes such as curvature, coherence, discontinuity attributes that give you an idea of where you might find faults or fractures. And they might be constrained by well information, or they might be relative, or they might be derivatives and combinations of attributes. So we can literally make hundreds of attributes from a seismic volume. And I've just listed a few here. And you know, some of my favorites, of course, are the elastic properties, the lambda rho, mu rho, and P impedance, S impedance, etc. But a lot of these, for example, the AVO attributes, the S reflectivity, or the fluid factor, or the gradient and the intercept, we can make templates for those, but that's almost like a different process. When you're doing AVO on something, you do that by itself, and you get an AVO expert to do that. When you're doing inversion, you do that almost by itself. You do Prestack inversion, you get an expert to do that. But really, as an interpreter, you'd like a way of bringing all of those together into your coherent view of geology in a geological cube. But this takes time. This can take years to understand how all of those things, what all those things mean. So what are our options? Well, I mentioned the physics-based approach. Physics-based is where you figure out your attribute geology relationships from first principles, incorporating well data, modeling. That can take time in itself, but once you've done that for your basin and your zone of interest, you know that it's not going to change significantly from field to field. Then you create those attributes, the ones that have a good relationship with geology. You create those from seismic data and you apply the relationships. With this process, you only reveal what you already know. Another way of looking at data is the data-driven approach. So this is where you find relationships in data. You just let the data speak to you. You let the data show you how it's clustering. And we saw that a little bit in the volve example, where there were two distinct clusters on the cross plot that didn't seem to relate to the template in any way, but by identifying them, we found regions of common properties. So that's the data-driven approach, and it's being open to revealing things in your data that you didn't know were there. A slight downside to this is that there may not be an obvious explanation for that relationship, but to me, that's not the main objective. The main objective is to get an interpretation that gives you validation at well control. You can explain it at the well control, and then you can extrapolate those properties away. So the data-driven approach is a valid way of augmenting and combining with your physics-based approach. There's also another way. We call this attribute advisor, and that's where you start with the answer in mind. You identify some geological regions that you're interested in, and you extrapolate using attributes that relate to that geology. Now, we may not know what attributes in advance are going to work for that. So that's what an attribute advisor does, is it discovers the relationships you didn't know existed, using the algorithm to scan and recommend attributes that relate to the geology you're interested in. So this is an AI function. And what happens here is, if you've got a profile, and this is a profile through a 3D volume, and part of it is already classified. So part of it may be classified already by the physics-based approach, where we know how to identify different layers. But if you, as an interpreter, know that in this particular well, there were two zones that were drilled here, and the upper zone was poor pay, and the lower zone was good pay. So the lower zone was a good reservoir, and you'd like to find more of that good reservoir in your 3D, but you don't know where to start. You don't know what attributes are going to work in cross-plot space to distinguish those two geological zones. So if you have, and it's quite typical for a lot of 3D surveys, you may have 100 different attributes. So if you're looking at two-dimensional cross-plots, and you want to investigate them all, well, with 100 different attributes, you're going to be looking at 100 times 100, or 10,000 different cross-plots. Well, half of that, 5,000, because the transposed axes would give you the same result. So I don't know any interpreter who's willing to look at 5,000 different cross-plots to find the one that's going to best distinguish their geological zones. But a computer doesn't mind doing that. So this attribute advisor function scans all the attributes, looks at all the possible cross-plots, investigates all possibilities, highlights the data points in every possibility, every possible cross-plot that come from the two selected geological regions, and ranks the cross-plots based on the ones that separate those geological regions the best. You'll see my slider bar here is just at the very top. So I have over 1,000, maybe more, cross-plots here. And if I went down the list, you would see them get more and more useless because the zones overlap. So we are looking for cross-plots within which the zones are distinct. So I just chose this one. I could have chose any one of these upper ones, but this one is the mean of the amplitude spectrum versus a Prestack P impedance inversion. So this is using one of those attributes that we may have not thought to look at. So the mean of the amplitude spectrum. Now that's something that we can generate easily. And when we choose that cross plot, We're looking at our Prestack impedance versus our mean of the amplitude spectrum. And the two zones that were initially identified, here the good pay and the poor pay, now we've used those to train the data, to find the attributes, find the region that represents those two geological zones. And now we're applying this to everything else in the 3D. So we're effectively extrapolating those zones away from where we trained it. And this is a very quick process. This takes 15 seconds to scan all the attributes and give me this cross plot. Now, as an interpreter, I have control over this. So I can either agree with this, I like it, or I can actually adjust these regions in the cross plot domain based on my judgment, and I can make those zones grow or shrink depending on how I adjust this. You still see the points that come from the regions I chose, so we can always go back to what attribute advisor suggested, but we're allowed to test sensitivities, test hunches, and just explore this new domain, this new cross plot that we never thought to look at before. We can also see this in map view and validate our facies distribution in the map view. That's also interactive. So when we adjust this and we make these zones bigger or smaller, the map responds to that. So we can really see and get a clear geological feedback and validation of our choices. I call this the human-machine partnership, because we're not just pressing a button and letting a machine deliver us an answer. We are pressing a button, the machine delivers us an answer, but that answer in this context is a suggestion. And the interpreter, the controller of the driver is the one that decides whether or not they're going to accept that suggestion, they're going to modify it, or they're going to try a different one. And so this is really an optimum human-machine partnership. As more AI becomes useful, then I think it needs to get incorporated into this type of arrangement where the human is always in control. The human always has the final say over what is the right answer, especially in geology. Okay, so what I've shown you so far is a way of speeding up our interpretation. So that's this part of the workflow. And you'll notice that I can't even fit the word interpretation on here. I've shortened it so much. But the idea is that we speed up the interpretation after having done all of these processes, the acquisition, the conventional processing, and the quantitative attributes. And all of these are still very time consuming. But even so, we've shortened our full timeline to by about 25%. And that's by interpreting in the cross-plot domain, having that machine partnership so that the machine can do some of the heavy lifting for us, do some of the scanning that gives us not only a faster interpretation, but also a better answer, a more complete answer. And we can incorporate also those non-geological attributes, which a lot of times get looked at briefly and then just pushed aside because nobody really knows what they mean or how to use them. But I've shown you a way of using them to help derive geology and improve and refine our interpretation. And we can also interactively test scenarios. What if we could go back even further? What if we could go back to the processing stage and incorporate, I'm not saying that we want to skip these other processes. We don't want to skip the quantitative attributes. We just want to incorporate that in more of an interactive interpretation. So that'll give us even more time for our decision scenarios and economics. At the moment, though, we don't have an example. I don't have an example of going all the way back this far. But what we can do is go further back within the quantitative attributes process. So that's what I'm going to show you in the next example. One of the things that we have trouble with as interpreters is when we get delivered our volumes, whether they're a stack or whether they're a density volume or a P impedance volume, when we get delivered those, we don't know the uncertainty in that volume. And we don't know what the sensitivity of those results were to all of the different subjective parameter choices in a QI workflow. So for example, and because we do QI is our business, we know that there are a lot of subjective parameter choices. And this depends and is influenced entirely by the knowledge and the experience of the person doing the project. So things like windows, wavelets, angles, scalars, well log smoothing, intervals, upscaling, extrapolation. You can read this. There are all kinds of different stages in that workflow where a judgment is made by a person. And that judgment is going to have an effect on the results. But when you get those results and you start interpreting them with them, you don't know what other options there could have been. What if you had control over those options? What if you could change them and see what your result, how your result would change if, for example, a maximum angle in the Prestack inversion was changed from 40 degrees to 38 degrees? What effect would that have on your final interpretation? So first of all, what is the sensitivity of all these parameters? And then what are the implications of, what's the uncertainty of all those parameters? How do we know we're right? And what are the implications if we're not right? How sensitive are the results to any one of the above? Maybe the wavelet is the most significant and the angle really doesn't make that much difference. How do we know that in advance? And also, who decides which options result in predictions that are closest to the truth? What is the truth? Do we know the truth even? Would we like to see different options? I would say yes. I would say when I was an interpreter, I was always wondering what the right answer was. And if we could see different options in reasonable ranges of parameters, we might be able to see things that we hadn't expected to see that might confirm geological models, or the opposite, might tell us our geological model was incorrect and that something else is better for describing what the actual truth is. Anyway, after that long explanation, I want to talk about how sensitive the QI workflow is to slight changes in parameters. So here's another view of our QI workflow. We put our, pardon me, our Prestack seismic data into our gears that do all the computations. We get P impedance, S impedance, and density out, and then we do further computations to get all of our elastic properties, even further computations if we're going to something like brittleness or TOC or deriving gamma ray or resistivity. So if we adjust some of these parameters, for example, we're looking at an S impedance volume and a predicted S impedance volume. I've got an S impedance log here at the well, and what I've got are slider bars for some of these AVO parameter selections. So when we are able to, as interpreters, adjust these slider bars, we can see changes before our eyes of the effect of these different parameter choices. So as we're adjusting this, we can either decide which one we like better, or we can choose multiple versions of attributes that we think might be closer to the truth. And once we've done that, then we have multiple versions of data on our cross plots, which gives us multiple realizations of our final interpreted product. So for example, if I chose one set of parameters, I might get this data cloud on my cross plot. If I chose another set of parameters, I might get this one. So here's two viable options for the prediction of Poisson's ratio and Young's modulus. And this allows us to test sensitivity and look at the different possibilities. If you'll notice, when I switch between one cross plot and the other, I get much more variation in my interpretation in this shallower section. The deep section stays pretty much the same. So this gives us a really good indication of the sensitivity of our different reservoir zones to changes in parameters. And then looking at this in the slice domain and the map view, we can see how those variations in parameters affect our map prediction of the geological properties. All right, so that's all I have to show you in actual real case studies, because that's as far as we've gotten in optimizing and accelerating the workflow in the interpretation in order to give our clients better inputs to decisions and more time to actually make those decisions. Ideally, we'd like to get back here. We would like to incorporate actual processing into the interpretation. So the interpreter has those controls over parameters and judgments that make a difference in their lives and make a difference to the final output. Now, if we can get back here and we can start incorporating processing components into and all of these stages into the interpretation, then not only do we have time to do these decision scenarios, but we actually get to drilling our wells faster and incorporating information into action and revenue sooner. So going back to what I started with, the seismic integration, what do we want? Well, we want it to be easy, relatively easy. So what I've shown you is that the interpretation of these attributes in the workflow I've described today doesn't require specialist expertise. In none of the interpretation part of it do you need to know exactly how to make a lambda row volume or how to make a rock physics template. These are all done by the experts. And in the interpretation space, it doesn't require specialist expertise. We want complete. We don't want to miss anything that could contain valuable information to help increase the accuracy of our predictions. So the way we address complete is by incorporating all the attributes for geological detail. We use machine assistance, but maintain control in a human-machine partnership. We want our workflow to be flexible. We want to be able to work with whatever data we have on hand, accommodate different types of data, but add in whatever comes available to us. So this new workflow can focus on and compartmentalize different zones with different resolution and uncertainty. We want this to be adaptable. So we want to be able to use our workflow for QC, for reconnaissance, detailed analysis, different basins or play types, incorporate new data. So with this workflow I showed you, both what's real and what's conceptual, we can control the depth of investigation by choosing the inputs, the zones, and the objective. And of course, we want this to be fast. We want it to be interactive, responsive. We want to do workflows, processes, and computations on the fly so that we can see the result in front of us in our interpretation. So what I've shown you partially achieves this. We can interpret in multiple interactive cross plots, and that provides instant validation to our choices and allows for data exploration hunches on the fly. So we can test out various ideas about clustering in the data or different geological scenarios that we'd like to test. So we can do that all very quickly. That's what this workflow allows. On the fly processes and computations, so that's where we're going even further back in the workflow, is still in development. That's something that we are working on. We're working on with our partners, our technology partners, to develop that kind of control and power on the interpreter's desk. So I just want to summarize now. Our objective as interpreters who work for companies who want economic efficiency, our objective is faster, more efficient, more accurate predictions for better decision making. And what I've shown you today is a new interpretation workflow that incorporates interactive classification of seismic attributes in the cross-plot domain. This gives the asset team time to investigate multiple scenarios, to work together, to integrate and consider options and economic outcomes. And integrating this detailed seismic information with confidence will lead to fewer wells. In fact, if we can believe what the seismic data is telling us, we can validate that with a couple of wells, but then we often don't have to drill as many wells. We save time and money that way. And new well information or conceptual ideas can be validated quickly, and the interpretation can be refined if necessary quickly as well. Understanding the reservoir more completely leads to production faster, which increases NPV. So we want to derive more value from seismic data, find and develop reserves economically, efficiently, and that's good for all of us. So that's all I have for today. Thank you very much for your attention. And I would like to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Lauren. I'm sure this is a very, very exciting presentation. I'm sure a lot of us have listened very carefully. Amadou, can you just have the workflow that she used to describe all of our presentation on the screen, so I can use that basically to give a high-level summary before we start taking the questions. So essentially what she has taken us through today is giving us an insight on how we can get quickly to decisions and basically relieve the interpreters of the burden of management pressure or having to come up with solution earlier than necessary. So she has gone through what is called the ideal data collection, data integrity, data analysis, and interpretation. And she said, in reality, we have limited data collection at the beginning, and then we begin to fill them up later as we move up the chain and have more confidence. She also said that often decisions are even made earlier, even before we finish interpretation. I can certainly register with that. And then she said the bottom line really is to understand the rocks and fluids. Very interesting. Example are porosity, permeability. And then she offered that machine learning, inversion, cross-plot seismic attributes are not all mutually exclusive and how to get into all this insight. And then she talks about the seismic integration. That is really what do we really want? And the most time we want it easy, complete, flexible, adaptable, and fast. And then she went into data transformation, basically offering a way forward to shorten our interpretation effort to make quicker decisions. She looked at various rock physics properties, options, and well-logged domain like the P-wave inversion, VPVS, various combinations of that, and then a lot of data conditioning, looking at cross-plot, the V-shaped nature growth and porosities, another combination. And then she went into the Prestack inversion domain, basically as a way to try to help us transform from some of these well and physics into a more of what we know, basically giving us a cross plot. So she look at the P impedance, the S impedance, and the density. And then she talked about the QI transformation, basically looking at the elastic property classification. Doing interpretation in the cross-plot domain, the seismic data to geological cross-plot, and then you can move into your geologic map and begin to see how those geologic maps begin to make sense. We can also interact that with our structures if we have it to give us a better understanding of what we have. And then she also talked about the multilinear regression for density. And then she delved into some geomechanics in the process, using normal compression trend and computing all attributes are not always possible according to her. Seismic attribute represent anything that can be estimated from seismic. Very interesting. We never know it all. There's a lot more information in the seismic that we can really get out of it. But she did mention that the onus is on us to look at what the seismic is telling us and see how we can use the information and basically gain an understanding to provide an answer or solution. And then she then said, what are the options that we have? She talked about the physics base, basically figuring out the attribute and the geological relationship from first principle. She talked about the data domain, basically using cross-plot, and then the attribute advisor. I found that very interesting. It's more of a machine learning, basically allowing the seismic or the data to speak to us and trying to make a meaning as to what they are really telling us. It's more like you have a body ache somewhere, you're trying to figure out what is that ache all about. So basically scanning for all useful attributes, and then you select the classification or the relationship that you can make to really give you an answer. So I can say what's a dosage of knowledge, basically taking us back to first principle and reminding us that we've not really been doing good justice to some of the information that we have in our data. So without taking much of your time, those are really the high level that I can take from her presentation. I hope I've been able to make justice to your presentation, Lauren, and then with the help of our modules, our publicity secretary that has been collating the questions. So he will come up with questions that have been posted, and then basically you'll be responding to them as the questions come up. Thank you very much.
Okay,
All right. Thank you, Dr. Andrea Jaisari. It is clear why you are our chairman today. It's as if we just had a speed version of Laura's presentation. All right, so let me jump into...
I could have done it that fast.
Let me jump into the questions right away. So we have Samir Saka from Egypt. He's a co-founder and managing director for Falcon Geology Limited. His first question is, in Prestack inversion, do you go for density inversion? Density is very, very sensitive to change in lithology and fluid contents, essentially the substance of the material, the intrinsic nature of that material. And then it goes further, and this is a little funny. He personally thinks he's personally anti-density inversion using Prestack inversion. So what's your feedback on that? So one of the things I'm going to do is give you like 2 questions or 3 that you can answer them as a series to just make the entire process more efficient. Then we have Akim. Akim Adigu is from Lagos. He's asking, what are the pitfalls? Does attributes answer all hidden concerns? How reliable is the inversion method in exploration phases? In the exploration phase, where no wells have been drilled within reasonable parameter. So that's Akim. And then we have
I'm gonna forget these questions.
All right, let's take the first 2 then.
One more, I'll forget them.
All right.
Okay, so the first one was anti-density. So I don't discriminate against any attributes. I think all attributes have some value. And yes, density is difficult to predict accurately, but even if it's not an accurate prediction of density, it's still an attribute from the seismic data. And it still varies relative to the geology around the seismic cube. So if you don't think that you're predicting density very accurately from the Prestack inversion, then don't call it density, call it factor X, call it something else. But often we do get a reasonable representation of density. And I think it's always worth just doing it. And you can always assess it afterwards. It doesn't do any harm to create the density attribute and look at it, put it into a multilinear regression. It often helps drive a more detailed prediction of density, and it can be an attribute in itself. So I don't judge attributes to begin with before I've even created them. I just make them and then use them and see what usefulness they bring to the interpretation. The second question was regarding what about inversion where there are no wells, or? Yes,
essentially, how reliable do you think this will be in areas where you have paucity of data, little or no wells, which effectively is what you have in exploration?
Right. So how reliable are your other methods in that case? Right? We can't be confident in anything when we have no wells and not much data to calibrate. But this particular workflow will help you explore every possible attribute and characteristic of that seismic data. And it'll definitely have uncertainty in it, but it will be the least uncertain of all your methods, because you will be able to investigate all possible ideas and see which ones work with the data and which ones don't, because you have the time, because you're doing things faster. You're doing things in the cross-plot domain, which means you're not clicking interpret line by line by line by line, picking faults. You can actually classify faults by putting in a discontinuity attribute and classifying certain regions of that discontinuity attribute, and that instantly classifies your faults and fractures throughout the 3D. I mean, there's going to be some refinement, but the idea is that this is actually even more important to do this kind of workflow where you don't have wells, because then you're relying more on the seismic data.
Okay, so a quick follow-up to that question. We have Philip Ajay Billy from Port Harcourt, Shell. So it's still around paucity of data, but it's taking it a step further. What's the best approach to characterize such fields and reservoirs?
Without much data?
Yes.
Well, then the human-machine partnership relies a lot on the human, because we need geological concepts, we need analog fields, we need to borrow rock physics templates from someplace we think is similar to what we're looking for. And we need to use our ingenuity, our creativeness to come up with models. And then we start using the machine to scan attributes after we've selected regions that we think relate to certain geological features we want to investigate. So we really rely on models and concepts that way. And I'm sure everybody listening has been in that situation, and you have to come up with an idea. You have to come up with several ideas as to what it is you're looking for and what the petroleum system might be.
Yeah, you have to evoke your experiences in such similar areas, evoke certain basic geological or fundamental geological principles. So we have Dapo Adeyemo, who's a senior formation evaluation expert from Chevron, from Lagos. So his question is, as your team drilled wells using this attribute information processing, were all the wells successful? He wants to know whether the wells were successful. So have you actually used this to drill a well? Were the wells successful? What was your success rate? How useful is the technology in mixed lithology environments? And can this technology be used to identify bypassed oil haze zones?
Right.
Where does bulk seismic acquisition come into all of this?
Okay, that's lots of questions.
Yes, that's why we're just go take him along.
Right. So first of all, our team is, our company is a service company. We don't drill wells. We don't always get the feedback from our clients, but feedback that we have had from some clients is that they have been successful. So I'll tell you one story about a channel play. So this was a sand channel, clastic fluvial channel play. And we were doing the inversion. We incorporated multi-component data. So we had PS, converted wave data. We were incorporating all of this in very systematically, very logically, but the client couldn't wait. They drilled their next well anyway. And it was not a good well. And not very many weeks later, we showed them the results of our analysis. We plotted the new well in our map, and it was literally 50 meters from the edge of the sand channel. And we predicted shale where they drilled the well, and we predicted sand 50 meters away. They went back and re-drilled that well and they found the sand. So, so this is where I get the idea that decisions are sometimes made regardless of what kind of technical analysis is being done. They had a rig waiting. They didn't want to waste the time and waste that rig, so they drilled the well based on the information they had. So that's one story. And then there was another study that we did where the wells had all been drilled. In fact, this was a very densely drilled field with 75 wells. But for the first stage of the project, the client only gave us 7 wells. And they said, we would like to see how many of these other 68 wells, you would have predicted correctly. So we did the entire process with just 7 wells. And this has been a published study as well. I think I presented at the AAPG, but we did this process 4 times, each time with a few more wells, to see what was the optimum number of wells and what was our optimum number of optimum amount of prior information that was going to give us the best predictive power. And so we found that in the end, after doing this process 4 times with additional wells, and the last one we did it with all 75 wells calibrating our process. And we found that somewhere between 7 wells wasn't enough, but 25 wells was too much. Not too much, but by 25 wells, we were predicting everything else very accurately. So at that point, we could have said, if we'd done this project for you, you would have saved yourself 50 wells. And these are all evaluation wells. None of these were production. These were appraisal wells.
So, quick question: what part of the world is this, and what basin?
This study that I'm talking about, this was oil sands. This was in northern Alberta, the oil sands place. So these are very shallow. These are very shallow targets. They're only about 500 meters deep. So drilling wells is not that expensive, but they still are, $500,000 to $1 million per well. So if you can save yourself 50 wells and instead acquire seismic data, you're ahead.
All right. I don't think I need to preach to anybody at this time and period in the world. Saving money is critical. So we have Julius Adesun from Lagos. His question is also around uncertainty. Please, how do you quantify the uncertainty away from full well control in the case of model-based or Prestack inversion products?
Mm-hmm.
That's Julius's question.
Okay, that's a very good question. I get uncertainty questions all the time because, of course, we know that we have uncertainty. Quantifying it is very difficult. And we have no real formula for quantifying uncertainty. We've got uncertainty in absolutely every stage of the process, from the acquisition, like just the geometry of knowing where our seismic traces are coming from. That's uncertain. We have all the parameters that we're choosing in processing. All of that is uncertain. We have our quantitative interpretation. We have our well data. Well data is uncertain. Rock physics models are uncertain. It's absolutely impossible to quantify that in terms of a plus or minus number. So the way we deal with uncertainty is we look at alternatives to our interpretation. And again, that's where this fast interpretation process really helps, because we aren't pressed for time. We aren't pressed by a decision being required, meaning that we can only look at one alternative. So if we look at multiple alternatives, we get an idea of what the range of possibility is, and that gives us an idea of the magnitude of the uncertainty in our prediction. So that's the way we do it.
Okay, so the next quick question, we have Aurelio Atoga, Port Harcourt Laser Engineering. He wants to know, in a much interbedded region, is it advisable to interpret your structures on inverted volumes? Can your software handle that? And I guess he's talking about a situation in our basin in Nigeria where we have clastics and a sequence of sand and shales. How reliable will your model be?
Again, that's asking about reliability is again asking about uncertainty. So that's that kind of, it's uncertain to quantify uncertainty. Sorry, what was the question again? Faulting, structured, highly structured area. Is that right? Oh, did we lose? Okay, yes, I'll answer the question. We're in the highly structured areas. Our software, and I haven't really talked too much about our software, but our software is not a conventional interpretation software. We don't interpret faults or horizons in our software. But what we do is we can classify faults. Like I said, if you bring in an attribute that represents faulting and discontinuity, you can assign a class to those highly discontinuous samples, and that gives you not your traditional fault sticks, but it just classifies those samples as being part of a fault. And then you can bring that into a more conventional system and assign actual fault planes to those discontinuities. So that's the way we would do it. And I know some of our clients have done that. I've seen examples of where they've taken ant tract volumes on coherence or covariance and used that ant tract volume to distinguish faults rather than putting it into a spatial interpretation system and click, 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 interpreting your faults one at a time. You just classify those samples as a fault class, and then you can use them going forward. And then anything that's not classified as a fault, then you subclassify the rest in terms of the properties.
All right. So if we want to talk about using different types of attributes to identify faults, I don't know how many, there are several techniques out there. Almost each interpretation software has one or attributes or multiple attributes to do that. So that's something that I think most of our participants are very familiar with. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to jump to Seyi Obafemi from Unilag. We wanted to know whether the inversion was stochastic or deterministic. Why was MLR used to determine the relationship between the geological parameters and the rock physics parameters in your case study? And I want to combine that with Timothy Akinagbe. He's actually sending his message from Calgary. He wants to know, most seismic data are processed for prospect intervals. Do you see an application of QI in interpreting and quantifying shallow drilling hazard anomalies? So those two questions, please.
Okay. So the first question was stochastic. Okay, so our inversions that I was showing you here today are deterministic. Stochastic inversion is obviously a very valid method. Stochastic inversion, however, is driven by a geomodel, right? So it's a geomodel that has a constraint that when convolved with a seismic wavelet gives you the seismic data. So it's a bunch of layers you're putting in based on a geomodel that really aren't resolved by seismic data. So by all means do that, but just be aware that you're not increasing resolution of the seismic data. You're just introducing layers that come from a geomodel. So you're combining geomodeling and seismic inversion. And that can certainly be done. And you will get multiple realizations of potential layers all below seismic resolution that could combine to give you the same seismic data. So all of those multiple realizations could also be put into the interpretation workflow that I showed today as attributes. Those could all be multiple attributes. You don't have to create one volume from all those multiple realizations. Now, I haven't done that myself, so I don't know how it's going to work, but you could choose a couple of realizations out of your 100 that you've done and say these two I find intriguing because they explain this and this, and they give me the kind of geological concept I'm looking for between wells. So you could choose a couple, or you could put them all in, let Attribute Advisor find the ones that relate to the geology you're interested in, or give you the answers that make sense to you.
All right.
Yeah. So what
the
was
one
the
on shallow drilling hazard?
Shallow drilling hazards. Right. Okay. So I think the preamble to that question was that a lot of times processing is targeted on a particular zone. That's absolutely true. And that's why it's very important to be involved with your processor prior to doing any quantitative interpretation. Because they will focus on the zone of interest. They'll do what they need to get down to the zone of interest, but they will often adjust their algorithms for that zone. So you need to be very careful and inform them that you're interested in multiple zones so that they do focus on those and get you the right answers or get you the best image in those zones as well. And once you get them, then definitely you can focus your interpretation on separate zones without affecting any of the other zones. So in the quantitative interpretation workflow, the actual inversion, you're going to have to do multiple inversions because inversions have to be focused. So you're going to have to do multiple inversions. But once you get those multiple inversions, you can bring them into the interpretation system and put them all into the same cube, because we have the ability of isolating the different zones, applying different relationships to different zones, using different data volumes in different zones, and making this composite geological cube.
Yeah, so I completely understand that. I'm now considering from a capital stewardship perspective, whether that will be worth all the effort, since it's a shallow hazard and we'll probably be able to see that. I'm just thinking aloud. Anyway, let me jump to the next question. We have one of our fellows, Mr. Charles Ojo. His question is, how well does a workflow work on land data? Do you have a workflow for land data? How does it affect the time of the workflow? What are the challenges to expect when it comes to seismic from collected on land?
Right. Well, I showed you two case studies. The Chad case study was land and the volve was marine. So, and most of our projects are land data, by the way, because most of our clients right now are in North America, so in Canada and the US, and they're mostly land projects. So we've worked a lot with land data. It does have processing challenges, and so you want to make sure that the processor is somebody who's very familiar with dealing with those processing challenges on land. Once the processor's finished with it, it makes no difference to us whether it comes from land or marine, because we are focused on the subsurface. We want to make sure that that the processing has been done correctly, and we do a lot of processing QC. We look at the various stages in the processing before we get the data. But once we get it, it really makes no difference to us whether it's marine or land.
Okay, so we'll jump. We have Yemi's Lagos. This question is, for multiple component seismic data, what are the seismic processing pitfalls when preparing data for your inversion workflow? And then a quick follow-up is from Wasi Odufiso, another ranking member of NAPE. His question is, how would you rate the success of this practice, whether it's in exploration or production? What's the accuracy and number of, in a second, and to use his exact words. Okay, number and spread of wells that are required for log curves. I guess he's just trying to get a feel of how many wells do you need, spatial relationship, make a reliable assessment. Right.
Okay. So I'll I'll address that first, because that's really the similar to the answer I gave before, where I talked about the different workflows that we went through with the different number of wells that showed how we came to an optimum number of wells. Now that optimum number of wells is very focused on that play in that region. So so really it's the kind of test that would need to be done anywhere, because you don't know in advance how many wells are going to be optimum. You can look at, and you use whatever wells you have. That just gives you the best result, is if you use what you have. And then as you add new wells, you see how that compares with your prediction of what they were going to drill. So that's how you assess. It's really hard to tell how many wells you need in advance. The first question was about multi-component data and how to prepare and condition multi-component data. So one of the very important things for multi-component data is not even in the seismic data itself. It's in the well data. The well logs, you need dipole sonics. You need to convince the team, the geologists and the engineers and the drillers, to acquire dipole sonic logs in all the wells. It's a little bit more expensive and not everybody does it, but it's valuable. It's invaluable information for calibrating, processing, and interpreting multi-component data. So that's one of the first things. And then in terms of preparing multi-component data for this process, multi-component data has multiple challenges, and you need to, again, that's the processor's job. And the processor needs to know how to deal with the different velocities, the different ray paths, the different geometry that is going to come from the multi-component data. I am not an expert in multi-component data processing, but I've certainly worked with several multi-component data projects, and I know the processing is kind of a circular process. And I'm really looking forward to when we can push this interactivity back into the processing workflow so that we can see the effect of these different that processors make when they're doing this, even in conventional data. But certainly multi-component data is very sensitive to those choices they make in processing. And then it's a whole, we've got a whole different workflow to incorporate multi-component data, which I don't really have time to go into today, but I have published some papers on that in the Interpretation Journal. There are 2 papers that I've published in 2014 and 2017, I believe, that are talking about incorporating multi-component workflow, or multi-component data in a QI workflow.
All right. So we've literally passed the question and answer time allotment by a minute. But I need to first apologize to Samir Saka from Egypt. He has a ton of questions we can't take. But the one question that everybody is asked in one way or the other is, what software package are you using? And we'll round up with that.
All right. So for the interactive cross-plot interpretation workflow, we use our own software. It's called QI Pro. And I think Kirk and Adebayo are going to speak to that a little bit in our sponsor presentation. So we've developed software for that purpose, and it was with that ultimate objective in mind, to speed up the process, to incorporate all the data, to allow more time for decisions and integrate everything for the whole team. So that's our own QI Pro software. For the inversions we do consulting projects as well. For inversions, we use Hampson Russell software. For the multi-component part of that, we have developed some of our own. For rock physics, we've developed our own code for that. And we incorporate that into Geolog petrophysical software. So we've done a lot of our own additional applications to some of these, and we also have our own standalone package, QI Pro, but it connects to Petrel, Decision Space, and Sizeware. So I'll let Kirk and Bayo talk a little bit more about that.
All right, thanks, Laurie. I'll hand over back to our able chairman to do the wrap up before we take the sponsor's remark. Doctor, over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, our guest speaker, for this wonderful presentation. Laurie and Weston, thank you very much for the question and answer section. I'm going to encourage those that were not able to take their question to please reach out directly to Lauren. I'm sure her email is available. You can send your question to her, and I'm sure she will be more than glad to provide you such answers. So at this time, we are going to default now to allow some sponsors remark. We have Kurt Graham, which is the Business Development Manager of Sound IQ, and Isaiah Bayo Kunlola. Isaiah, are you still around? Also, we'll be making some remarks. After that, I will yield back to Latif Amodu for announcements, and then the president will come up to give all of us a vote of thanks. So over to Kurt Graham and Isaiah.
Great. Many thanks to the Nigerian Association of Petroleum Explorationists for organizing such a well-run webinar. And special thanks to all the NAPE volunteers that really make that happen. You've been a delight to work with. And today we heard from Laurie Weston of Sound QI, who's built her own software, QI Pro, and has been using it for well over a decade. But just over 2 years ago, Laurie and Sound QI's chief geophysicist, Carl Riney, formed Sound QI with a clear mission to discover meaning from data. And part of the vision to achieve that is to really leverage that technology and that human creativity. I think Laurie brought that through today in her presentation. This is done through a combination of software and services. We do provide those services, the advanced seismic analysis, the petrophysics, rock physics, attribute classification. But QI Pro was built to integrate seismic data and to help deliver technically excellent projects. Now that software that has been refined for over a decade is available to all interpreters. And Sound QI has a breadth of experience globally. Today we talked about onshore, offshore, even got to mention some oil sands. Little shout out to Alberta. And we were successful in leveraging QI Pro across a variety of those projects internationally. To get that reach though, and especially for our software, that's a key piece. There's that integration to the knowledge and the data assets, but also to those different expertise that exist and local knowledge. And that's where we bring our partners in, technology partners to advance. We have some amazing things that we'll be announcing in the coming year on the technology front as well. But to provide that multilingual support, local knowledge, and local expertise. Sound QI in Nigeria love this mission statement: to promote the study and practice of petroleum geosciences. Really nicely assisted by our mission statement to help clients discover meaning from data. But mega yield, bridge the skill gap in oil and gas. That really brings it together and makes it possible for us to be successful in Nigeria. And we are very blessed to be affiliated now with Adebayo Isaiah Okunlola, president of Mega Yield. And he brings this breadth of experience, onshore, offshore, a lot of African experience, North American, deep water, shallow. And that knowledge, that professional touch, that experience is so critical for us. And I think the most important part is that empathy component, that he's sincerely interested in assisting clients. So I'd like to yield the rest of my time to Bayo. Bayo, I'd like to introduce you.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. Yeah. Mega Yield and Sound QI were interested in assisting our clients in cutting their development and exploration costs, and we have various platforms of getting this thing done. If you are interested in our software, one of the things we're going to do for you is we'll assist you in getting the value out of your data, essentially by setting up your project properly, choosing your data, and also assisting you with your QI strategy. You and I know that it's garbage in, garbage out. If you don't get the data set up properly, your result might not be useful. And we're not just interested in selling you the software, I mean the QI Pro. We want to assist you in assimilating the knowledge. We have different platforms of getting this thing done. First and foremost, we can assist your organization in training, either through one-on-one training, but because of the pandemic ongoing right now, we have customized that kind of a training to an online platform. And it's not just an online platform kind of training, it is going to be an instructor-led kind of online training in such a way you can ask questions and stuff like that. In addition to that, we have a giveaway today and subsequently, because one of our goals is actually deepening the knowledge of a quantitative seismic interpretation worldwide. So Sound QI and Mega Yield, we have an half-day online training. It's going to be live and it's free for any NAPE member to participate in. We have one scheduled for August 25, 2020, 3 p.m. Nigerian time to about 7 p.m. It's going to be online and it's free. In addition to that, we have a quantitative seismic interpretation theory training. which is going to be paid for if you are interested in that. And in the times that we are in right now, this is actually an online training. It's going to be instructor-led as well too. So if you are interested in that, we just need a minimum of 4 participants to make that thing happen. IOCs, independents, you can take advantage of that. All you need to do is get in contact with us and we can work out the structure on how to get that thing done. In addition to that, our goal is actually trying to deepen the knowledge of quantitative seismic interpretation. We want to partner with universities as well. We have done this in University of Oklahoma. We've done this in the University of Calgary as well, whereby we donate our software to university, but that has got to come with a condition. We don't just want to give software to any university that they are not going to use it. So currently we are talking to Wasiu Odufison. He has a deep knowledge of what universities are in Nigeria that are really serious about doing the interpretation, and based on his experience on the university assistance program. Universities can approach us directly also with their program. If they want to use our software, we're going to donate it for them for free. And we still want to train the trainer as well too. So if they're interested, we're going to be able to do that for the university as a part of our corporate social responsibility. Yeah, I think that's enough for now. Okay, we have we had worked with the Society of Petroleum Engineers in here in Calgary. We recorded a training for them, and it's open to all the Society of Petroleum Engineers worldwide. So it's a free training about quantitative seismic interpretation for engineers, where engineers will understand the value of quantitative seismic interpretation. And industry, we need to be talking with this with the same language and the same kind of understanding. So you can pass that information to your engineer friends. That is available. And we're going to provide the link to NAPI, link to all those training for registration and so on and so forth like that. So if you want to hear more about this, you can contact us directly. We are going to provide our information to NAPI. Actually, that information is on the last slide. How to get in contact with us and how to take advantage of our software, as well as all those freebies that we have offered today.
All right. Okay. Thank you very much.
So thank you so much, Isaiah and Kirk, for those sponsors' remarks. So now I yield back to the Publicity Secretary, Abdul Latif Amodu, to take us through the announcement, and after that, our able president, Mr. Alex Tucker, will come up with a vote of thanks. Latif.
All right. Thank you, my chairman, Dr. Andrew. This has been amazing. Thank you, Laurie, for the excellent technical presentation. Questions are still coming. You do expect to hear from us shortly with a list of questions. We apologize, but people want to know more. And thank you, Kirk and Bayo. Now, as regards NAPE, tomorrow we will be having a masterclass tomorrow. This is pretty important because right now, as we speak, there's a marginal field bid round going on. And I think this is a timely masterclass. So in case you've not heard about this, I think it's important that we give you some quick information around this. So the masterclass is going to take 2 days. It starts tomorrow and ends next tomorrow. The expectation is that the content of the masterclass includes regulatory and physical framework, including business arrangements, understanding of technical and commercial considerations, knowing how to read, evaluate, and understand a competent person's reports and carry out an analysis of that report, and take all this information as input into field economics, whereby the appropriate financial considerations and funding schemes are put together. If you have not registered, a couple of people have registered already. Please do register. The class is tomorrow, 9 a.m. to 12 noon, and it's for 2 days, the 16th and 17th. Based on the responses we've had so far, I believe we will have a follow-up session, but let's take care of this. Also, if you want to join NAPE, please go to our website or all our platforms, NAPE Nigeria. You clearly can see that we're sharing a lot of fantastic and insightful technical content and topical issues. Having said that, it's my honor to invite our president, Mr. Alex Taka, who's a fellow of NAPE, Mr. Alex Nachi Taka, to give the closing remarks. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear, sir.
Okay, thank you very much for a wonderful session. Before I go into the final vote of thanks, I just want to mention that the joy of being a part of this presentation has been so much. The reason being that I personally started off at the website, just like Laurie said, people drill, they don't even share the result at times. I had the opportunity of being together with interpreters before taking those beautiful maps to the website. So it was quite interesting in those days, working with interpreters, taking the maps to the rig to monitor and guide the driller. The geosite geologists will do that with so much confidence because you've been part of the interpretation. So Laurie, I want to, on behalf of the Executive Committee of NAPE and the entire NAPE membership, just appreciate you for the wonderful presentation. I'm also one of those that want interpretation to be fast. I'd love to see that well drilled, because without drilling a well, that interpretation is just useless. So the faster it's done, and I love to listen to presentations that just tell me within a month, the rig move will commence. So you have met and exceeded our expectation, especially at this time that every manager wants to cut costs and still make a discovery. So there's no better time for this presentation than now in the history of the Nigerian oil and gas. And NAPE will help to promote this across the industry. I want to assure you. I also want to mention that the comment from Bio, ability to donate. I'm a strong advocate for industry-university collaboration because the students, the lecturers need to know what is going on. We're going to work with you closely through Washu. He's a very high-ranking member of NAPE. He's a fellow of this association. He's been a past ESCO. We work through him to get this software deployed to the campuses, and whatever needs to be done to get the lecturers and the students to understand, we'll work with you. We appreciate this partnership. We encourage such partnerships that look towards bringing some of these technologies back at home. That's the beauty of reaching out there. We appreciate those of you that are out there and still think of how to help us here to save costs. There's no much funds at this period, and this presentation is quite apt. We do our best. Laurie, together with Kick Graham, we appreciate you. We appreciate your team and the company. We want to encourage this partnership, and we want to assure you that in a very short while, you'll be hearing from some of our corporate members asking to test this software within the Nigerian environment. It's our duty to help to promote what you are doing, and we're happy that you have a lot to donate. So there's so much we're going to do together. Time will not permit me. I want to appreciate our public secretary, the president-elect, and the entire media team for putting this together, and especially our staff at the secretariat that helped with the advert. We had over 235 viewers worldwide as part of the people listening to you. That's a very good number. Looking at the topic, it's encouraging. So you can imagine the extent your discussions have covered. We want to assure you our support. We'll likely call upon you once again to do more of this as we progress in our relationship. Thank you. We want to wish you a wonderful time. We want to wish your company and this partnership a very fruitful relationship, and we'll be there to support. Thank you. Have a blessed day and a memorable week ahead.
Okay.